Welcome to Behind the Podium, Unveiling the Coach. Problem solvers have problems too. So here at Behind the Podium, I, Jared Cohen, and my co-host Alexander Ellis discuss the struggles, philosophies, demands, and practices of the coach, or said more broadly, health and wellness practitioner. To provide quality coaching is to enhance someone's life in an everlasting and unfolding way. This is not easy and requires a lot of due diligence and self-mastery on the part of the coach to be able to perform. So without further ado, join us as we dig deeper into the depths of the coach's mind. Welcome to Behind the Podium, Unveiling the Coach. This is our inaugural episode.
Woo!
I am Jared Cohen, joined with me,
Alexandra
Ellis. This is a podcast in which the platform is to discuss the internal struggles, philosophies, demands, and practices of a coach / healthcare provider, taking that term coach more broad, even thinking about it as far as what it means to be a coach, have a coach, and or any avenue of providing value for another individual that advances his or her life. To provide quality coaching is to enhance someone's life in an everlasting and unfolding way. This is not easy and requires a lot of due diligence and self-mastery on the part of the coach to be able to perform. Therefore, this podcast will be a medium to dig deeper into the depths of the coach's mind.
Mm-hmm.
So we hope to unveil some clearer gems from our own ponderings about coaching and teaching and being a student with this podcast, as well as peel back the veil from other coaches and dig a little deeper into some of these vulnerable realms of our own thoughts of what it means to be in this seat where we are being required to uphold a high standard of responsibility to make sure that we're providing the best service and not letting down those that are putting our trust in us to provide this service of help in whatever way. Obviously, both of us come from a movement background, but this could be emotional type of consulting. This could be just being a math teacher, being an author, and writing down your ideas about what it means to live a better life and how you would go about putting those ideas on paper and sharing them with others, and then going into your own life and trying to lead by that example.
Yeah, and I think one of the most interesting things for me when you brought up this idea was not only to start asking questions about, best practices. What do you do? What do I do? What have we found works? What doesn't work? But have a platform where we're able to express some of that vulnerability of like, hey, I'm not really sure what to do here. What's the next step? And I think you also touched on this idea about being a coach and how so many different avenues can lead you into that coaching or leadership role, even if you're not expecting it, but being a coach offers us the opportunity to, as you said, improve and enhance someone else's life in a lasting way. And it's not always in the gym. It's not always in the yoga studio. These opportunities come up all the time. So I think some of the really exciting topics that we'll be able to cover, which I'm super stoked on. We'll start to ask those questions about how to be a better leader in whatever field you're in or whatever podium you're standing behind.
Yeah, I agree with that. And to piggyback, this idea of, can you convey information to anybody in a manner that ultimately empowers them, right? So that whether or not they want to give that information to someone else, the way you've given it to them, it inherently holds the keys for them to be able to coach it to someone else. So that, it's not just kind of relaying pieces of content for rote memorization, but like the fact that somebody actually feels like that now they own it. They own these ideas. It's a real empowered form of sharing, and we further the learning process because we as coaches want to instill that self-sufficiency, and with that self-sufficiency somebody feels empowered to say that like, hey, like I taught my neighbor this, and now that in and of itself unlocks a lot of greater things for the sake of actually making change, and change that's meaningful to people.
Totally. And I think being able to empower people comes from a place of authenticity, which you mentioned, just rote memorization. I'm just, spewing out what I read in a book or repeating what, my teacher told me. But being that person who asks questions, who's a learner, but then also curious to figure out, well, like, how did you make that work? And how can I integrate this into my life? Or how can I make this authentic to me so that when I share this lesson with whoever I'm coaching, it can actually land?
Yes. We'll quote Gil Headley here. Maybe we'll get him on the podcast. I'm planting these seeds. But my favorite quote from Gil, the Somanaut. If you're unfamiliar with Gil's work, check out gilheadley.com, I believe.
Yeah.
And he said, we get smarter not by answering more questions, but by asking better questions. Mm-hmm. And that to me was like, oh God, it's okay to ask questions. And to be thinking about that process of like, we're continually peeling back. And I think that's why I'm so excited about this podcast and how much gratitude I have for the podcast medium, and like how thankful I am for all these other people that have been using this medium to share such great information and invoke the long form conversation as a way to ask these better questions and get us all thinking about things in a much more in-depth and dynamic way than little snapshot tweets or even just the long form of a book. Sometimes like because that's not so dynamic, we're left having to assume one thing or another and not invoke a further type of investigation process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I was always the question kid. Like, I think my dad even had a shirt that said, because I said so, and there was a kid version that said, why? And that was always my question. Well, why? But asking better questions, not just why, but being able to, formulate the question that will actually get you the answer, which I think is what Gil is touching on as well.
Yeah.
And I would hope it is a skill that people develop, because even if you're trying to Google search, you need to be able to ask a good question to get the answers that you want, or all of a sudden there's 100,000 search results of something, you're like, ooh, that's not what I meant.
And to be empowered to know it's okay to ask a question. Mm-hmm. And as coaches, can we coach and teach in a manner that's inherent in our structure, in our dialogue, that, people are feeling like, hey, like, well, I can ask why. And like this coach has created the environment that I feel comfortable asking why, and that you should be asking why.
Totally.
So,
and if you have a coach who can't answer why,
then
send them our way.
Right. And And actually that's a good metric for asking yourself whether or not that coach is as qualified as they should be, or if they're just repeating some type of memorized heuristic that they've inherited.
Mm-hmm.
So moving forward here, Alex, I'm going to have you give a little background of yourself, and then I'll give a background of myself, and then we're going to go into each providing a quote that will bridge us into our main topic of conversation for this episode.
Totally. I am a movement educator. I teach yoga tune-up, the role model method. My earliest movement teachings began in yoga, and I went from there. I live here in Los Angeles, where I do weekly public classes and weekend workshops. I also have the wonderful opportunity to travel and lead teacher trainings across the U.S. And my educational background, where I was forced to ask millions of questions, it was like pulling out my hair. I have a degree in exercise biology from UC Davis. And so I walked out of college with a lot of questions, way more questions. I think when you start to educate yourself on any topic, you find that you know even less than you thought you knew before. And so when I started teaching yoga, I felt really unsatisfied with answering people's questions about why the poses were this way, or, why am I feeling this, or what should I do for that, with responses that had been given to me by my teachers, or responses that relied on, ooey wooey yoga stuff. I mean, I love yoga and it's a wonderful practice, but I couldn't explain to people why their shoulders hurt and they weren't strong enough to do this pose with chakras and karma. It just didn't work for me. And so Gil Headley was also one of my anatomy mentors. And obviously Joe Miller, the creator of Yoga Tune-Up, helped me to bridge that gap between biomechanics and anatomy and movement. And that's also how I met you, Jared. But what we realize is movement is movement is movement. Regardless of the context, what both of us are trying to do with our students to, empower them with the knowledge of how their bodies move and how their bodies work so that they can start being curious and start asking questions and have the power to just be more than why does my shoulder hurt? But have the tools, whether it's, therapy balls or even just hearing me say biceps tendon enough times in class that something finally lands.
Did you get into exercise biology? Did you choose to go that path? Was it because of yoga?
Oh, it's actually a funny story. So I wanted actually to be a doctor for a while. I wanted to be a dermatologist, and then I was like, oh, medical school, that looks really hard. And then I was considering PT, and so I, props to UC Davis's marketing department. I got a postcard in the mail. My older brother was currently enrolled at UC Davis, and so when you say the types of things you're interested in, when you take the SATs, they send you postcards. Right. And it was a person on a bike hooked up to a VO2 max machine, and they were testing maximum output during exercise, and it looked just like a Gatorade commercial. And I was like, oh, that looks so cool. And I knew I wanted to go into biology. And so when I was looking at course offerings for biology, it was a lot of cellular stuff, and that, microscopic wasn't up my alley. I'd studied it in high school. And so the course offerings for exercise biology were everything I wanted, biomechanics, pathologies, exercise, sports science, sports psychology, all of that stuff was totally engaging and exciting. So that's why I decided to do UC Davis. They were the only UC that offered an applied biology program like that. And I'm one of the few people who never changed their major. I went in as an exercise biology degree major. Impressive. I know, right?
So you went in as a freshman knowing...
EXP major. Mm-hmm.
Wow.
The things that interested me throughout the 4 years changed, but now I'm a major. I did one thing I always regret, and I give my mom such a hard time about this. I wanted to do a music minor because I am a creative person, and I studied classical piano for 8 years growing up. Pretended to play the clarinet in the marching band at UC Davis. It's very hard to march, memorize your music, and play at the same time, so I just marched because that was all people would know.
Nice.
Yeah. And I never pursued the music minor. It was like a couple classes, and it would have been just a nice break from organic chemistry to be able to go listen to some Bach. But yeah, that was the only thing I changed.
So you actually had your clarinet.
Yeah, I still have.
And you marched with it, but you weren't actually no notes.
It was in my mouth, and I was moving my fingers, but I was in a football stadium at halftime. You up in row Z are not going to know if I played a note, but you're sure as heck going to know if I step to the right and the rest of the marching band went to the left.
This is true. I actually in high school was in the jazz band, and
I did that too.
Jazz guitar is really difficult and very non-essential to the other jazz instruments, like drums, piano, the horn section. So there was a lot of just miming,
just hanging out
that went down. A few actual notes that came out of the guitar, but the people in the audience, I at least got that. I was in the jazz band.
You should have come to my high school. We had a really avant-garde music teacher, and we played. It wasn't like swing. Most of the jazz bands play that 40 style, big swing stuff. And we were doing modern music and weird beats. We had, I don't even remember what the one piece was, but we had a guitarist and bass player, with multiple guitarists, and they all played. So you could have come to Hoover. We would have taken care of you. I played my piano and my clarinet in jazz band. I did actually play there because I didn't have to move at the same time, so it was much easier.
And see, it comes back to movement, multitasking.
I know.
All right, last question I have, and then I'll give my background. Is so you finished your degree before you got introduced to Jill Miller and Yoga Tune-Up?
Yes. So while I was in college, I worked as an athletic trainer. And so that was one of the cool things about UC Davis, in that we had just transitioned to be a Division I school. So the athletic training program was still largely supported by students, kind of volunteers, kind of employees, because we kind of got paid, but we didn't really. So there was 6 full-time certified athletic trainers, and then a staff of 25 or 30 students, and we were assigned to teams and got to travel with teams, and it was a really awesome experience. But in the summertime, we would have to fill ice buckets or ice trash cans for the football players to ice down after practice. And I was pushing one over, and who knows if my core was tight. I didn't even know what my core was at that time. And I pushed and twisted and really pissed off my lower back and did nothing. I did nothing. And about a month later, I was like, oh, weird. The outside of my foot hurts in the morning, but I don't remember hitting it. And so I was starting to experience sciatic nerve pain at 20, which is super crappy. And I would go to the physical therapist, and she'd be like, okay, well, lay on your belly and do this gentle tractioning back bend. And I was like, do you see me? And that was a perfect experience of somebody just delivering the rote information that they've read in the book. Right. Do you see me as your patient? I'm not 80 years old. Yeah. I have to ride a bike every day. I'm an active person. This is not working for me. And so once we finally got that resolved through some actual traction, did you know they still have, I'm not sure what the technical term is for it, but it's a stretching rack that you put yourself on to create enough traction in your spine so that the bulging discs can suck back in. Wow. I know, it's crazy. So I did that. Core strength. So that's how I found yoga.
So yoga was not this was around college time that you got
I was in
involved.
College. I had been working in a yoga studio from about 15 years of age onwards behind the desk.
Right.
Yeah. And so I was like, I don't know what they're doing in there. They're oming. And
but you never actually went into any of the classes.
I didn't take classes.
Oh, wow.
No. So when I was injured and the PT was like, oh, you need to do core strength. I was like, oh, I think I remember that thing where they call it yoga. Yeah. And so in college, I'm sure you remember, you're living with multiple people, your schedule is crazy and hectic and irregular. So yoga became a like mental safe space.
Yeah.
It was quiet. I was living with 5 other women in a 4-bedroom apartment at the time. So it was so great to get out of the house. So that's where I started with yoga, and I already had a therapeutic flavor to what I was teaching, and what I was learning and what I was taking. I've never been like the exercise workout yoga where they're like heated and the music is pumping and they're going as fast as they can, like a vinyasa flow. That's never been my style. And, a couple steps down the way, doing yoga. I was working in the fitness industry, and through that is actually how I met Jill Miller at a fitness convention. I was introduced to her. Actually, this is a funny story. My boss at the time, I had met Jill at a yoga therapy conference. I'd taken a class with her, balls underneath the upper traps. And you lift your hips up and you're like, holy shit, like, I don't know what this is, but I know I need it.
Yeah.
I don't know. And so came home raving about it. And my boss at the time, when we ran into Jill at this fitness convention, the first words out of my boss's mouth were like, oh, this is Alex, Jill. She's obsessed with you. And I don't know if Jill remembers that, but I was like, oh my God. Totally
Stop it. Wait, so you knew of her work prior to going to that?
Yeah, and then I took the teacher training probably a couple months after that, but I had never, other than the class at the Symposium on Yoga Therapy and Research, which is a yearly conference. It's so awesome, put on by the International Association of Yoga Therapists. They present research studies that they're working on and practical applications of the research, all within the yoga sphere. That was my first introduction to yoga tune-up. But right away it was like, oh, you mean I can talk about anatomy and muscles and mechanics and not be ashamed that I know all of this and I don't know the Sanskrit words? And I don't know that chant that other person says after class. Like, I can use what I had gathered in college and my curiosities and my interests to help people.
When you took that level 1, did you feel really ahead of the game in terms of the anatomy?
Yeah, because for many people it was the first time that they had ever been introduced to it, and it wasn't for me.
Right.
I definitely didn't retain as much from, I feel like I know way more now.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was wondering is like, what I think is interesting. Like, I could see how somebody, who didn't have the anatomy background gets introduced to yoga tune-up, right, and then like goes like crazy on the anatomy, like they go reverse. Mm-hmm. So I'm kind of curious how, like, your applied anatomy understanding has changed, right? Because you have this degree that sort of assumes, like, exercise biology. Like, okay, she knows her origins and insertions. But like, the question, right? Like with any sort of degree is like, how much truth in the application is there? And I think this is one of the things we'll talk about more, like, as a theme in all the episodes is, titles, right? Like, what does that really mean? Like, I think more and more people are becoming PTs now, which is interesting, as this functional movement mobility thing is really catching fire, which then kind of dilutes the scene even more, right? It's like, who really knows their stuff, and yet but by being a PT, you get this doctor in front of your name, and then that assumes certain things. Yeah. I think like Jill has this sort of contradictory, interesting sort of positioning because she doesn't have any sort of doctorate to her, but she, is the perfect example of a teacher. Yeah. Above an educator, above all else. Right. Because even in the level 1 training, it speaks to the visual learners, the kinesthetic learners, the book learners, all of the, it really, whatever your strength is in learning, you'll get something out of the course. So I wasn't stressed out by trying to remember some muscles. I was, because I didn't remember anything in college, because all of my university education, for the most part, assumed that I was a book learner. Uh-huh. And it took me until I was out of college to be like, oh, if I stand during lecture, I won't fall asleep. Oh, weird. I wish I had known that. Right. So anatomy in college was go to lecture,
try to stay awake, even though it was the most interesting thing ever. I just like, when I stop moving, I mean, as we're recording this, I'm standing because when I stop moving, my brain's like, oh, rest, and falls asleep, even if I'm so interested. So as, sit at lecture and we talk about the muscles and origins and insertions, and we would, so much more than that, nerves. And if you can see it in a cadaver, we were talking about it during lecture. Then we would spend about 10 hours in the lab with cadavers, staring at structures, trying to memorize what they looked like and what they felt like and where they ran through the body, because at the end of that week, you would have a test. And it was one of the few classes that wasn't curved. This is actually kind of messed up. They found that when they curved the class, people would intentionally sabotage one another in open lab. I know.
How
they would have
do that?
So they have open lab where all the cadavers are out, and so you can go and look at what you want. But there's probably 400 people in this class at any given time.
Oh wow!
Not in the lab, but in the lecture piece. So then you all have different lab times, but open lab is open to all sections. So people would come up to ask something about what was on a cadaver. And most of the time other students would be answering your questions because there's a limited number of teaching assistants. And so people would give the wrong answer because it would behoove them, if you got the answer wrong, that their grade could be potentially higher if the curve was lower. I'm like, I know. I'm like, oh my God, there's no hope for humanity anymore. So it was one of my few university classes that was not graded on a curve because these cutthroat, that's another thing, academia, my experience with it was that it was so, you're in it for yourself.
Yeah.
And this community that you and I are a part of, and that the movement world, for the most part, we're all about helping to lift our comrades up, to help everybody. And who cares if what I tell you helps you to be better at what you do, because ultimately we're all trying to achieve the same thing.
Totally. This is a good point. And hopefully that quality transcends the title trumpings that others are searching for in a egotistical manner, as opposed to actually following a path that is passion oriented and not just taking prereqs to fulfill certain certain quotas.
I'm not saying I loved OChem, but I do now have a degree.
There we go.
Yeah, perfect example.
Check the box. All right. Well, I am Jared Cohen, and I am originally from Chicago, Illinois, and have been out in Southern California for a little more than 5 years now. I originally started undergrad in Eastern Washington, at a small college in Walla Walla called Whitman College, and was there for 1 year, and started my sophomore year with a bunch of digestive issues that plagued me, to the effect that I decided I had to take a leave of absence, come home, recalibrate, heal. And it was during that time home back in Chicago that I found CrossFit. Ooh. And then decided to continue undergrad at a different college, the Claremont Colleges in the Inland Empire of Southern California, just outside of Los Angeles, and got my degree in psychology, while I furthered my involvement in CrossFit at a gym nearby the colleges. And it was the combination of CrossFit and psychology, and some other events along the way, Seal Fit and Kelly Starrett's Mobility WOD, that then I found myself on this path of continuing to take all this, what I refer to as extracurricular type of learning opportunities, certifications, and seminars, that has now put me where I am today, having coached CrossFit classes and individuals since 2011, and became a yoga tune-up teacher a year ago, and have now just begun a master's in sports psychology and business, and just trying to put all the pieces together. So yeah. What were you gonna say?
Yeah, I was going to ask you, because I found out about mobility WOD through Jill, because it was mentioned in my level 1 yoga tune-up teacher training. Just how did you find it? Because you were into CrossFit before it totally blew up.
Right, yeah. It's interesting, like thinking back on it, is I remember like earliest memories, I remember being back in Chicago. I think this was, so I found the first CrossFit gym I started at was CrossFit Chicago in 2010. It was literally the beginning of the year. And then I attended, I moved out to Southern California that summer, and then it began my sophomore year at Pitzer College in the fall of 2010. And then I think I was back home in Chicago over winter break and was looking at CrossFit Chicago's website and saw that like on a Thursday where I was planning to come in, it was like their rest day and they just linked to Mobility WOD. So then I remember clicking that and seeing a video that I didn't like quite understand. and that like really just is an example of how my beginnings in CrossFit were so in lieu of quality coaching. Like I never had any fundamentals type of program. There was never a communication regarding like what all this stuff means. I remember like coming home from my first CrossFit workout, not having the cliche experience of like, wow, that was awesome. It was more like, I was just like confused. I was like, yeah, that seemed like a good workout. There was a lot of different things. I don't really know what happened. Like that there wasn't like this delivery of context, like why this matters, what is unique here. And so that, you know, then when I'm watching my first Mobility WOD video, I don't have like any like reference of these movements that I'm doing to like make sense of what Kelly is trying to do, even from just a basic, like how to help you with your performance perspective. And then it was so I then got my level 1 CrossFit certification in the early spring of 2011, and heard kind of mention of the website again there, you know, like people asked a question about like, you know, it's interesting because this was like still in the beginning too, where people are at this certification and, you know, starting to kind of ask these sort of black box questions of like, well, like what if like what if I have this issue or that issue that like they're really not ready to ask, and like kind of, I guess to them, like, thank God that like Mobility WOD existed for them to just like throw that out as an answer. Like, well, check out Mobility WOD. Like there's some answers there about like how you can open up your hip. But
what does that even mean?
Right. Exactly. And so, and then it was, I then had found out about the SEAL Fit program in Encinitas through the CrossFit Journal, and did that the summer of 2011. But before I did that, I remember experiencing some shoulder pain, and so then I went back to Mobility WOD, found some videos regarding shoulder pain, and that was the first time I like applied a lacrosse ball on my shoulder, and still didn't really know what was happening. You know, again, like just this lack of context, even lack of good content. I remember being at SEAL Fit, and again, like it was stressed, like, hey, you guys are doing a lot of stuff. You know, we need you to like recover well. Like, here are some rollers, you know, and like, so like after lunch, we'd be kind of rolling on stuff, and none of us really knew what we were doing, but just kind of hoping that, you know, we'd feel a little bit better. And
it's kind of like everybody rolls because everybody's rolling.
Yeah,
like,
right.
I don't really know, but that person's doing it, so it's probably something I should do.
And like, you know, another one of these phenomenons in which, you know, something catches on, and unfortunately it's catching on without the best delivery medium, and you know, they're again getting lost in translation. But it was after SEAL Fit then that like that was such a unique experience from both like a psychological and a physical perspective, where I was like, it really opened my mind beyond CrossFit and saying like, wow, there's so much more out there. And and then I started diving deeper into like Kelly's videos and really started to kind of catch on to like with what he was, at least the superficial message of like, hey, you can fix yourself, you know, like,
Yeah.
and that like really connected to me in such a contagious and then like infectious way where like I wanted to like, without even really knowing what he was talking about, I wanted to like share that with others, being like, no, like you got to check this thing out because this guy suggests like it's not fatalistic, you know, like this shoulder pain. And so then like pretty much right after that summer, I think September of 2011, he was doing a certification, his like mobility and movement,
Right.
And then I jumped on that bandwagon. And
I think it's super interesting too, based on what you just said about you had shoulder pain, and instead of, because I think so many people, you know, myself included, I did nothing because I didn't know what to do.
Right.
Just like, well, I don't have time or money. You know, I was a college student. I don't have time or money to go get a massage or, you know, go to the PT because at this point it's just an irritation. It's not like a huge deal. But that you went to Mobility WOD and already started asking better questions about how you could solve the problem. It's really cool.
Yeah.
Did you find out about Yoga Tune-Up? Because that's how we met one another, through Kelly?
Yeah, so that was through Kelly. It was actually so I then in California, the first gym I then joined and then started working at was a gym called Dalton's CrossFit, and then I left Dalton's CrossFit and found myself at Axiom CrossFit, and I started working there trying to apply all this mobility stuff. But at the time, this was 2012, like the mobility stuff like still hadn't really caught on.
Yeah.
But yet like within the CrossFit space, like yoga was still seen in this light of like being the appropriate catharsis to the CrossFit stuff. You know, again, like just total disconnect about like movement and position and how you do one thing is how you do everything. And it was just like, well, I beat myself up here, so I need this thing to like unbeat myself up, and then I can continue to beat myself up.
Yeah.
So Axiom was kind of like, well, if you, and it's funny to me that like, again, this whole yoga thing, like depending on what space you're in, like nobody really knows what that means or how they define it. And
yes. That could be a whole hour's discussion on its own.
And so like I remember like even like nowadays, but now it's different because like it's sort of infected because I have this yoga tune-up title. But before I had any sort of yoga affiliation, people would always be like, with what they saw me doing, whether it was like a Kelly Starrett thing or just something like I'd come up with to solve a problem, people would be like, what is that yoga stuff you're doing? Right. And like, I never thought of it as yoga, but like, that's the only way they could categorize it.
It's not CrossFit, so it must be yoga.
Yeah, it must be yoga. So then Axiom was kind of like, well, look, if you want to do like some yoga certification, like then you can do a yoga class here. And so like the only like thing I could find, so like so initially I knew of Jill through like a Mobility WOD video, and this was like 2012, and I was going to do that, but I was like, I don't know if I can commit to like a week, like right now. So I found this Yoga Fit program, and they had a weekend certification. So I did that, and then from that experience started teaching a Sunday yoga class at Axiom.
Why do CrossFitters only do yoga on Sunday? It drives me crazy.
Yeah, it's like, because like that's like supposed to be the quintessential recovery day.
It's like CrossFit church. Go to yoga, vinyasa yoga on Sunday morning and try to bend yourself into a pretzel because that's how you're going to perform better. Like, really?
Yeah, and like to Yoga Fit's credit, like I actually like walked away with like just some basic tools of being able to kind of put together like a movement flow that like wasn't like super complicated, because they like their context too was like, okay, how could we provide this in like a, you know, fitness setting,
right?
And that was eye-opening in terms of also just providing like a different context for people to come in and also expect that like, hey, like this is going to be down regulating versus like wanting to do some kind of down regulating piece within a CrossFit class, even if it's just like the last 10 minutes of a class and not being able to hold anybody's attention because like that's not where their head is at for this class. Like, you know, that like, hey, you just got a really good workout in. Like, we have 5 minutes left. Like, don't go and do another 100 sit-ups. Like, you don't have to. like, please don't, you know?
All of my complaints.
So,
well, even in, because I teach mobility at a gym, a CrossFit gym, and I spend an hour trying to help people relax. And there's a CrossFit class happening at the same time. We're at least in our own separate room. But I give so much credit and I have so much respect for the athletes that come to mobility because they are attempting to relax and downregulate when like Tiesto is blaring in the other room and you hear weights dropping, and they still do it. It's not like in a yoga studio where I get people to fall asleep, but they're still able to even just like take it down one level or down a notch at the state of their nervous system. Wow, there's that music. CrossFitters are so interesting and magical creatures.
Which is like also another one of those like catch-22s that you think about, like, you know, how like blown out and like adrenal affected are people that like they can like almost like even in a CrossFit like loud music setting they can just kind of like pass out, right? This fact, I think about that sometimes, like, you know, doing a class when I'm in a class and like it's time for Shavasana, like it's a good example that I'm not well rested, right? It's like I'm like just out in like 5 seconds.
Sleep.
And like not able to like engage any sort of like more active meditative process.
The interesting thing about that too, a trainee in this past week's level 1 that I was assisting Jill on, I have to like do some more. He answered a question and now I have more questions. But he said like the different like waves, you know, like theta waves and alpha waves or whatever that your brain does. Even when you fall asleep, if you're in this like higher level, like stressed brain pattern, like that doesn't just turn off when you're sleeping. That you can still be stressed out. Like your brain is still stressed while you're sleeping. And so even falling asleep, it's like if we're not doing these practices to unwind somehow, sleep is not enough, you know?
Right. And that was like the point I made before we started recording, right? Is that like, you know, my eye mask falls off and then you could argue like, oh, well, you're already asleep at that point. But like, then there's this whole just black box of like, well, what's the quality of that sleep? Like, is that sleep even worthwhile? You know, it's like someone can take an Ambien, but are they actually getting
the restful
sleep? Yeah. And those types of things become the hardest to convince people of when they're not even conscious to retest, you know?
Yeah. Well, and I don't want to just like bag on CrossFitters because I love CrossFit. I also am a CrossFitter. Because yoga space, there's still that idea of let me stretch myself from limb to limb as much as possible and that I will achieve more with more pain, more sensation. And, you know, even trying to tune out the sensation, the cries of their tissues to like, please stop stretching. So I think every movement modality, everything from even walking, that if it's not done consciously, and you're not able to ask, well, like, why? Why are you doing this? What is your goal? That anything can be a problem.
Yeah, and this is where I think the impetus and the inspiration for the podcast comes is like, okay, I too like hold that concept of skill first really near and dear to my heart, and then because I'm holding that near and dear to my heart, that's the message I want to give to others. But it like skill first requires so much cognitive energy to like really make sure all your ducks are in a row. And then what is that balance of being able sometimes to just like feel and just move in not such a cerebral space and find the different switches so that you know, people, coaches mainly, like don't become so obsessive about the nuances that then like relaying it back to just that lowest common denominator audience doesn't get so diluted and misunderstood. But like, there are just these tiers where, like, in some circumstances, in the first place, we have to express to people that like these are all complicated processes. Like even just the act of walking, and we need to like be humble to that, and not like suggest that now every time you take steps, you're like neurotic about taking your steps, which like even I'm guilty of.
Flex the big toe and contract the buttocks.
Yeah, right. But at the same time, like let's be humble to that, and then use that as the sort of standard to say that like, hey, like everything involves a higher order of operations and correct sort of problem solving to achieve that optimal state. And once we start peeling back the layers, then we can start kind of putting the pieces back together to say why this isn't working or having problems here. And that should be, the cool thing that clients and coaches are walking away with, to say that like, hey, if I can distill these principles for people, then we can connect these dots and people can start getting excited about these unifying principles, and how then movement is just this really good conduit for learning experiences and evolution in every other part of your life. And I think, that's where, we've both come to in different paths within the movement sphere, and where I think, Yoga Tune-Up, of all the, mediums, does it best to integrate the movement with the mindset piece, and give people a medium for conversation about how these things are related, and that the mobility piece is a means to get me to move better, but oh my god, it's also a means for me to like realize that like I'm holding so much tension in my shoulder and also my gut, and now this is affecting the way I'm sleeping, it's affecting the way I'm thinking, and we start answering certain questions and then obviously asking more questions about how we can improve, but the answers now become way more diverse than just being related to how you're squatting, how you're doing your downward facing dog, et cetera, et cetera. And that's why, I think, this is another topic of conversation for these episodes is, should like all coaches, should all teachers, should all healthcare practitioners, like they all need to have some movement practice, right? They like should everybody who's teaching have like base, like even if you're just a math teacher, like a second grade math teacher, like should you understand basic breathing principles? Like should you know how to do like just a squat? Like like okay, like
that would change things.
Yeah, right. And like and to have these prereqs not just as like prereqs like how to use a keyboard, like so that you can be relative in this 21st age of technology, but prereqs because if you understand these breathing principles, then you can tie some of these pieces back to your students who are really stressed out about math, and
I think though it can't just be the teacher's responsibility, and I think something that you and I are all trying to do is to educate people about their bodies, so that they are going to do it. The yoga studio I worked at in high school and did my 200 and 500 hour teacher training was called Yoga at the Village, and they had a phrase, a tagline that I think is really great and will fit quite nicely. It was introduce your mind to your body. They just might like each other. And I think that a lot of what we do, no matter what the medium is helping people to better perceive their bodies in movement and in stillness, because then they're going to just make better choices about what it is that they do. Now, you sent me this really awesome blog this week about the different kinds of coaches. I think we've already kind of touched on it. I'm like, okay, am I going to give you like a ton of technique, or today am I just going to like cheer you on? Or do you want to talk more about that article?
Yeah, let's jump in there. So, little shout out here to Kenny Kane, owner of CrossFit LA, and he used to have a podcast called The Positivity Project, which unfortunately you can't find on iTunes anymore. I don't know if he plans on putting that back up, but I bring him up for two reasons. One is that on his podcast he interviewed Kelly Starrett, and he also interviewed Carl Paoli, and it was those two interviews that I feel like are the best interviews Carl Paoli or Kelly Starrett have ever done, because of the environment that Kenny set up in interviewing them, which dug really deep, and got me thinking about this idea of like, what is the coach's struggle? You know, is that those of you that are familiar with Carl Paoli or even Kelly Starrett, you know, they're big names now as far as like, you know, movement internet celebrities. And when you see them on their, you know, videos or even in person, of course, the assumption is like, you know, they have all their stuff together and, you know, they're good to go. And I was fascinated and took a lot of solace in hearing Carl talk about, you know, some of his own psychological struggles, periodic bouts of depression that he went through in writing his book, The Freestyle Connection. And I think it's just important for all coaches and teachers to feel connected in this space of like, you know, hey, like we're all trying to figure it out, and it's hard on one end because we are trying to be confident in the messages we convey, and in that confidence we have to put up somewhat of a facade, and yet we also want to be authentic. And so Kenny was a big inspiration there. And then piece two that relates to this topic is it was my work with Kenny at his context coaching seminar, where he really made me wrestle with this question of, as a coach, are you more of a motivator or are you more of a technician? And ultimately, it's that ideal overlap. It's that balance that you want to strike, because, you know, a motivator, too much of a motivator is just kind of annoying, and too much of a technician is perhaps boring and not really striking an emotional chord with people. And as we said, you know, we want that mindset piece to be a big part of it, and we want it to be a big part directly because we know that it's existing for everyone in some capacity. So,
would you say the motivator is kind of like the cheerleader?
Yeah, and I think that's like a question, you know, for us to ask and think about. That's where I struggle, is like, I don't like being the cheerleader. Like, I think there's a place for it, but I guess I've developed over time, coaching classes and even coaching, you know, personal clients and working with people in competition settings, is that like, my association with the cheerleader is so superficial and one-dimensional that it like puts a bad taste in my mouth. And that like, I feel like usually the cheerleader is so devoid of helping somebody address the underlying causes that, you know, I've maybe veered too much to the technician side of things. You know, we all know the
technician would be the beginning, super focused on this is how the move is done with all of these different pieces, and this is how we fit it together. Yeah.
So one of the articles that we were thinking about and bringing this topic up beyond my being spurred by Kenny Kane's comment is Tony Retrossi. He has a blog. Do you know what the blog is called?
I do. I have it open. The 10 types of coaches and how to spot them.
So
I think the original article was actually on breaking muscle.
Breaking muscle, yeah. And so he has these 10 types: technician, learner, programmer, observer, the professional, motivator, the presenter, the friend, the judge, and the athlete. And one of the adjectives he uses to refer to the technician is the eye of the technician. So I think that's a good adjective in thinking about what it means to actually understand what you're seeing. Mm-hmm. I heard Kelly Starrett say, I think Tim Ferriss, one of Tim Ferriss's episodes, he had Kelly on and asked Kelly what he thought defined a good coach, and Kelly's very succinct response was, a good coach understands what they're seeing. And I think a lot of us, especially in the beginning, we're looking at people and we don't really understand what we're seeing. We're just trying to get them moving.
Yeah, I'm like, I totally, I had that issue as well. In my 200-hour teacher training, our teacher would all the times get somebody in the pose and like, well, do you see what's wrong with it? Like, no, oh my God, I have no idea. Like, their arm is 2 degrees too far this way. And so I'm curious for you, like, what do you think helped you be able to see what you were seeing? Because I know for me, it was taking the anatomical, language and directions of movement, and then knowing from, what's anatomical neutral to be able to actually see where people were making movement faults. So understanding that underlying principle, and then looking at tons and tons and tons of bodies. And then you can't stop looking.
Right. So there's definitely the frequency of exposure, right? And you build that pattern recognition. But honestly, I give most of the credit to Kelly Starrett as being the best, for me, starting point of creating context, and like his systems approach for saying, okay, like, let's just define this neutral spine, and then let's think about the primary movement that the hips and shoulders are going to go through, and what is this element of torsion that we're looking for. And that paradigm, that framework, then became really paramount in how I could then listen to a bunch of other coaches with a bunch of different philosophies, and then take that information and filter it back through this systems approach that Kelly presented. And to this day, still am kind of filtering mainly through that lens and the succinctness of that, to just make sure that, at the very least, you're kind of seeing the big things first and not obsessing about some of the minute things that maybe, that we see all the time in yoga tune-up can be resolved. The minute things will be more resolved when we deal with some of these bigger things, and being able to take a step back. And this is, something I'm always trying to give to fundamentals is like, hey, like, let's understand the ideal neutral position of the spine. Let's understand the primary movement and joint capsule element of the hips and shoulders. And now you have like a basic framework where, like, hey, if you're having any problem in your lower body, I would start with like your hip region first. If you're having some basic problem with your upper body, like if it's something at your wrist, I would start with your shoulder, spine first. And then kind of work down the chain, and just kind of using that as bookends, becomes a big piece. And then the eye has a better chance to focus in. I think, sometimes it's like, I've heard someone say that, once you have more information, you're able to see things more simply, right? That like somebody that really understands the game of baseball, right? Like they're not, they're not watching it with all these like little pieces of information. Like they're watching it very holistically, but it takes time to digest all that information. And then, it's quick to see some of the bigger faults. And so, an issue I always like struggle with then is like, okay, how do I continue to motivate while also like calling people out about certain things that they need to be working on that, I find this is much easier and usually not an issue. Like if you're dealing with like a first time client, especially someone that like is walking in there already kind of apprehensive and just like wants to make sure they're doing the right thing. But if you're dealing with any sort of client that like already has established like their identity with this thing, and this is like in any space, right? The yoga studio where, how you have somebody that like does like 10 vinyasas a day and like the downward dog is like their profile picture for all their things, and then you're suggesting that like actually their shoulders are not in the best position. Like at first that's very demotivating. And that's always like a fine line I'm walking, especially, and what I've trying to get a better handle on now is just like, is just kind of trusting the relationship to unfold and be maybe more reserved in some of the coaching you're going to give off the bat, especially if it's like the first time you're meeting somebody. Let them kind of like get to know you in more of a way that allows them to approach you than you like, I have this kind of like savior complex sometimes where I'm like, oh God, like, no, I don't want you to develop more of these bad habits. And like, what if like, this is the thing that like breaks the camel's back? And like, cause I've been there and like, there were coaches that like didn't keep me accountable. And so I'm like, I have to tell you and
I have to save
you. And perhaps like that's, maybe good intentioned, but, ultimately not beneficial for either one of us because, I'm putting too much stress on myself and like they're not responsive to it,
Yeah. Well, I was thinking, as far as like the technician, like your first experience with CrossFit and like my first experience with yoga too, just like what just happened, and so understanding and respecting that people who come to our classes or who we're able to be exposed to in whatever the context is, whether you're doing like, corporate presentations where I'm never going to see these people again, or maybe they are coming to my weekly class or it's a special seminar or whatever, that all of this information might be new to them. And even if it's not all new to them, it may be framed differently. So less is always more, because then I'm able to like let something land and then not immediately, throw something else on top of it. And so, I've found that to be very successful. That, keeping it simple, and then also repetition with the technique, which is something you can only do if it is a regular type of class where they keep coming back and they keep coming back and they keep coming back. But maybe even in the span of the presentation, instead of this, keeping it simple, instead of 15 different ideas and techniques that I want to convey to you, I'm going to do 1 or 2, 5 different ways so that those can stick somehow. Because the other thing, like with learners, people aren't all the same type of learner, and so one cue or description that works for you might not work for the next person. So as the coach, it's my job to be able to articulate my thoughts and ideas and cues in how, a million different ways so that I know that it can resonate with the student. And then I was thinking too about the motivator and being a cheerleader. Not that I ever was a cheerleader, but I know cheerleaders, really nice. They probably would take offense at your authenticity claim.
This is true.
But I think as humans, and I don't know if it's just an American thing, but I know here in LA, people are hard on themselves. They're really hard. And always critical about, like, oh, the size of my apartment or the clothes I wear or my hair today or like superficial things or maybe even deeper things than that. And so when somebody comes to one of my events, if I'm there with them and I can give them a compliment, even if it's just like, oh, great job protracting your shoulder blades.
Yeah.
I mean, that's, one positive thing, and who knows what they get through the rest of their day. It might just be negative self-talk or, from some outside person all day. And if I can land that one compliment, and it comes from a place of truth and authenticity, then that's awesome. So I hope, that There's a fine line for sure. Less is more for everything. Because if you're just cheering like, oh, great job, and that looks great and beautiful, great, awesome, it loses its meaning because it's just become a repeat word.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I think, Tony's adjective here for motivator is the encouragement of the motivator. And I think that should be the reoccurring point of the motivation. And I know for me, like I'm always trying to, sort of undulate my tone within a class setting where sometimes like when I'm speaking to a group, the tone might be more serious depending on the information I'm trying to convey because I want them to take it seriously. And whereas at other times, like on an individual basis, the tone may change to a much more friendly, joking tone to also to let them know like, hey, it's okay. Like this is not going to be perfect. And like the last thing I want is for you to be beating yourself up or invoking negative self-talk about how you suck or reconfirming a belief system that you're not very good. And that's where like my passion for the technical side of coaching is to get people to have these pieces of technique that allow them to more readily access their potential, is that like, as opposed, because I think most people are just, they're still walking in with this fixed mindset of like, well, it's like, I can either do it or I can't, like things don't come fast for me. And then there's those self-fulfilling processes that I can just see on people's faces. I'll teach, I'll demo something, and then they've already assumed that they can't do what I've demoed. And right. the common thing I always get is like, oh God, could you have made that look any easier? And my joke is always like, well, I don't think you'd like the alternative if like I'm making something look really hard, and then you're thinking like, well, if he had such a problem with it, like I'm going to be,
Yeah, I know.
So, but yeah, I totally think they're, this idea of encouragement, in the support system of just like letting somebody know like, hey, it's okay. Like, you don't have to attach any sort of outcome based mindset to this, like, especially if this is the first time or this is like the billionth time. But that's also where, as a coach, as a teacher, can I set the environment up where they're going to be more successful coming out the other end, and not just putting them in a space where, they take on this big beatdown or this huge sweat that
right.
potentially gives them a false sense of accomplishment, but perhaps in the long run is providing some problems.
So do you think you're more of a technician than a motivator? Or is there another coaching style that you definitely resonate with more?
So I think if like an outsider was looking at the way I was coaching, they'd probably categorize me more as a technician. But like the argument I would make in defense of my motivating qualities would be, I attended a sports psychology conference at John F. Kennedy University, where I'm attending now, back in May, and there was a long time now retired football coach there that was he said, if you want to motivate somebody, teach them a skill. Right. Ooh. And that to me is like what I'm getting after is like, and it's like within that then more of my cheerleading side will come out. Right. Because now I'm excited. And when I start seeing people like take an extra second, like, or when I see people correct themselves, like in like a momentary way where like they were starting to get down to the bar, but they were like loading in a rounded position, and then they kind of stop themselves, like stand back up and like take a second to get organized. Like that's when like now I'm like, yes, you are the best, you know, and like,
Yeah.
and I'm going to talk them up and make them feel really great about that, you know, within that process. And even if it's only like happened once, you know, and for them to, you know, to kind of be able to correct once, and maybe then like the 9 other times, like it doesn't happen so well, like that's okay. Like, you know, we're like, we've just kind of crossed that starting line, and now we're in it. And so for me, it's that process of unleashing my motivator side, when there's, that meeting in the middle or so, with the people that I'm working with, and the energy that that I want to come across with. Like if I'm only doing, you know, sometimes like if I'm only doing a like role model ball therapy class, sometimes the motivation will come out of like, of just trying to get people to know, like, it's okay that, like, you know, some of these things are really hurting, or like also like, don't freak out if like you don't think the ball's in the right place, you know, like, like this is totally not the, like, you know, especially when I was teaching in the yoga studios for a little bit, is like, I found people so self-doubting about, you know, just ball placement. And like, they were like, you know, I even heard things like, you know, I feel like I'm failing this thing. And I'm like, no. Like, this is your prep, you know, like, so that your downward dog can be better, you know, that like, don't view this practice time as a failure by any means. And so I think it just comes back to like redefining, what it means to be a motivator and what are the nuances there. The Talent Code by Daniel Coyle is another inspirational book, and he's a big one to say that, like, look, like we've been misled in thinking that, like, you know, Denzel Washington in Remember the Titans is like that ideal coach. And like, don't get me wrong, like I like fantasize about like being Denzel Washington in that movie, like, but really the like the ideal coach is more of that one on the sidelines that is like, it's just like little course corrections, you know. It's a coach in which like they're not trying to be the center of attention, you know, like they're quick to pass off the torch, and I think that's where I would make the argument regarding Tony's post that, like, you know, there's some overlap here, and you know, the like being a technician and being a learner and being an observer and being professional, and like that all these things converge together when you're thinking about how you're going to program a class and how you want everything to then unfold more successfully. And then perhaps the like application of that is then seen in how motivated you get the class to become, based on that presentation and based on their level of motivation and enthusiasm and response to what you're doing. Then you're creating some of these friendships for people to trust in your process, even if it's a little contrary or unknown and unexpected to what they thought they were getting into. Yeah,
for sure. Do you, just out of curiosity, is there any of the different coaching types that that Tony was talking about that you wish you, not even wish, but that you hope to get a little bit more of? You feel like you're lacking, you want to get stronger in?
I think succinctness, clarity, and with those coming, being able to embrace just this less is more quality. 2 weeks ago when I attended Kenny Kane's context coaching seminar, and we had opportunities to role play the class, the type of kind of class that we were going to teach. Kenny's main piece of feedback was like, you got a lot of great stuff, but like, it's too much, and,
save some of yourself for us later.
Yeah, totally. And I think that's, and I think I'm also in an interesting place now where I'm not doing any personals. And I look back now on kind of where I was 6 months ago, where I had this combination of working with new clients one-on-one, teaching classes, and then also having personal clients, and the personal clients being sort of my main time where I could experiment and like play with all the different tools and things I'm thinking about currently. And so being able to
the laboratory.
Yeah, the laboratory. Whereas like I think in the classes now that I'm coaching, like I don't have as much of the personal clients in my life, so I'm like trying to like I have all these things I want to play with,
gotta get them out,
and sometimes the class program is so limited, and so like sometimes that turns into like, whoa, there's too much here,
It's so interesting because not in the yoga space in general, but in my work, I feel like it's a total opposite in that everything I do is kind of on the fly. So through my insatiable curiosity, I'm always constantly learning new things. And then I'm like, oh, let me share this with you.
Yeah.
And so as I was looking at some of the qualities, the being able to see bodies move and where things are going wrong, and then I almost bubble over with excitement at new learning. And that's where I stumble sometimes because I'm like so excited to try something out, and it falls flat, And there was a thread of some yoga tune-up teachers, I think it was only a week ago or something, where they were asking like, well, how do you do your programming? And people had, some very complex programming, arcs and themes and schedules, and I always do this. And that was the first time for me where I was kind of like, oh, I don't do that. So I think if I had to build any technique or any quality of coaching, it would probably be the analysis of the programmer. But, I mean, what are your thoughts about, because my creativity fears being stifled by planning.
Yeah. So like I'm kind of similar in that like I find that where I'm most, when I think about people talking about like flow state, like it's those times where I'm coaching where I don't really have a plan, that like I am getting into that like flow state. But like you said, it can be kind of hit or miss. And what I struggle with then is like the misses are when like I'm trying to kind of embrace this creativity and opportunity to bring something in that's more original, and yet like this is off the agenda somewhat for like the main things we have to get to today, which like I didn't even decide, right? This is like the agenda for all the classes, and then it becomes this thing where like now maybe more like there's too much information because now it's being crammed in like a smaller time that I have, because I sort of went off track a little bit to invoke and just provide myself with like some selfish
an outlet for all that bottled up creativity.
Yeah, and like for me, like the opportunity just to like enjoy that process of sharing some new information and see how it works. But what I'm working on now though is from both Kenny Kane's context coaching seminar and then even the Yoga Tune-Up Teachers Summit is trying to be better about actually doing a little prep, and like thinking about the class beforehand and forcing myself to like write out how long I think certain things are going to take, which like is really uncomfortable for me. Because then I'm like kind of writing it down. I'm like, man, I can't get to anything. Like,
the truth.
Yeah. The truth. And And so, but I think that's like what I'm struggling with, and then trying to be more, be more analytical in that way, and perhaps can I get into this rhythm where like I'm ending sort of the to-dos of the class, like I'm getting those done with like 10, maybe 5 minutes at a minimum to spare. And then with that leftover time, maybe try something different. I think the clients usually respond to that better than like I've tried to do all these different things and now I've taken the class up until like literally that last minute where people now like are rushed to get out, and now they feel like, their time has been taken advantage of. So it's I think that's what's hard. And I think, ultimately as the programmer, I would hope that more coaches are thinking about programming not just from a standpoint of pieces of content that they want to get to, but also having time to dig deeper, and so maybe, and that's what I struggle with when I'm like taking on a class of agenda that like I didn't come up with. And I thrive much more when there's less to be done that day, like maybe the workout of the day is just a 10-minute workout. And so now it's like, oh, I got like 45 minutes to like
to play with,
mess around. Figuring that out, and also being able to embrace the motivator side of me, when, the class is like heavily booked with 10 different things, and I have to just accept that like, hey, like today is not going to be a technician day, and like today we're not going to get into like some fancy stuff and to play around, and we just kind of have to like check the box on these things and not let my own negative feelings about that type of class then override my charisma, and demeanor that may otherwise be less upbeat and exciting for what's to be done.
Yeah, and I think as coaches and teachers, understanding the why of what we're doing definitely helps with figuring out what's going on. And at the end of the day, it's like you're saying, like, oh, I feel bad, like, oh, that class, like, same thing, like, take a leap, fall. For the most part, I feel like students, first of all, they have no idea that in your head you bombed, because it's not about us as the leader.
Right. Totally.
That they still have their experience, and they still took away something from it, even if it maybe wasn't necessarily the total lesson plan that I had in mind. They still got something out of it because it's not about us as the coach, but which is like why as coaches and leaders and teachers that we need to continually be curious to keep pushing ourselves forward so that we're not stuck in this rut of all the same,
Yeah. What do you think about this ability of the athlete, but, obviously the athlete being referred to as the coach,
right?
How important is it for the coach, the teacher, to have some standard of ability that, like what is that standard? What is that metric? How do you address that with yourself? Feeling like, hey, like I'm able to maybe demo this, or I'm able to have full ankle range of motion,
Right. Well, because I'm also programming my own stuff.
Yeah.
I teach what I know and what I can do.
Totally.
I had a coach in high school who was an athlete, and I don't feel like I learned a lot. Because the athlete type gets super frustrated when you can't do it like they can. Then are not able to teach you how to do it, to give you that technician side, the skills of, whatever's required. I almost feel like being able to do the movement or whatever it is is important for your own embodiment as a coach and leader to be able to like kind of work through in your body what's happening, but isn't required.
Right.
You know, like some of let's take sprinting, for example, just because, and I'm saying I'm a sprinting coach, but just because a sprinting coach can't, Usain Bolt, do you think his coach can run as fast as he can?
No, of course not.
No,
Right.
but because the coaching skills come from being able to see all of the pieces and give the athlete all of, the elements that they need. And then ultimately it's up to the athlete or the student to put it all together and make magic happen. But I don't have to be perfect for them to get something out of it.
Yeah, and I think this will be a good kind of wrap up and potential preview teaser for the next episode, is that it's not necessarily the ability to be perfect, nor is it the ability to like match every client you have in their capacity,
no.
But the ability to practice what you preach, to like if you're suggesting that your clients shouldn't throw their head up when they're doing a pull-up, this classic chicken necking over the bar, then like you shouldn't be doing that either.
Yep.
And that's where I think the rubber hits the road. And that's where I think like, we come back to all these other terms like the motivator, like nothing motivates me more than seeing the people I look up to, like living and breathing that thing. And nothing motivates me less than when I hear people coaching, teaching a certain standard and principle and not being able to embody it or hold themselves accountable to that and actually, cut some corners. So that is...
Say until next time.
Till next time.
Being able, the same thing as being embodied.
Nice. Rephrasing the embodiment concept in more ways than one. Let's just end this way, the way I wanted to start, which is we're each gonna present a quote. So I will let you go first.
I'll let me pull it up. So my quote is from Brene Brown, who I'm totally jamming on right now. She's an author and a researcher, and she is excellent at the power of storytelling, and that's how she does her research, but also about vulnerability and being able to pick yourself up after a fall. So I just finished her book, Rising Strong, but this is actually from a previous book of hers called Daring Greatly. Only when we are brave enough to explore the darkness will we discover the infinite power of our light. I really like that idea of being, again, curious, being able to ask why, being comfortable with being uncomfortable, so that you can take the next steps.
Definitely.
What you got for me?
So this comes from the book, The Obstacle is the Way. The Timeless Art of Turning Trials into Triumph. This is written by Ryan Holiday, who is a fascinating character. I recommend people check out. And in his book, he quotes Marcus Aurelius, Roman emperor from the let's see here, the gladiator time period. The particular years of 120 to 180 AD. He was actually a
Oh my gosh.
Roman emperor from 161 to 180 AD. And Ryan Holiday starts this chapter called Channel Your Energy with Marcus Aurelius' quote, which is, "When jarred unavoidably by circumstance, revert at once to yourself and don't lose the rhythm more than you can help. You'll have a better grasp of harmony if you keep going back to it." So just again, this idea of how do you keep your own equilibrium and have an equalizer to come back to where it doesn't have to be such a one end of the spectrum to another, but you're able to regulate more minutely than feeling like all of a sudden you've landed in such disarray, and it has to be such a process to start over again. And
Totally.
Sometimes it's that process that is so daunting. We are all victims of procrastinating, and if maybe we can find more of a rhythm that doesn't that buffers some of the huge turmoil and derailing, then the mistakes, the failures, the darkness doesn't have to seem so daunting, and it's more approachable. So with that, we will close out.
Well, Jared, wait a minute. Where can people find you?
So,
Jared, where can people find you online? People
can find me online at cpbgrowth.com. And it's Deraj, ITSDERAG, on Instagram. And I think that's pretty much it. You could,
you're not a Twitter guy.
You could go on the Yoga Tune-Up page and type my name in there. Alex, how about you?
You can find more about me and what I'm up to in my weekly blog at aewellness.com. And I'm on social media as at Holla for Mala.
Holla for some Mala.
Holla for Mala.
Holla for Mala.
Thanks so much for listening. I'm really excited for getting to pick your brain and asking questions. And who knows if we'll ever figure anything out. But if we have more questions at the end of this, I think we've done our job.
Agreed. And just the opportunity to verbally journal our ponderings.
Totally.
All right. Till next time.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Hey guys, thanks for listening to Behind the Podium, Unveiling the Coach. If you have enjoyed what you listened to, head over to iTunes and leave us a review. More information on each episode and the podcast in general can be found at behindthepodiumpodcast.com. We'll catch you next time.